They represent a very small number of inmates, but the housing of transgender prisoners in Scotland has been a burning issue in politics for almost a week. Last Tuesday, trans woman Isla Bryson was convicted of 2 counts of rape for attacks carried out whilst known as Adam Graham. On Wednesday, responding to concerns that Bryson had been taken to Conton Vale Women's Jail, the Justice Secretary said he trusted the Scottish Prison Service to come to the right decision. On Thursday, the First Minister, while confirming a risk assessment was underway, told MSPs that Bryson will not serve a sentence in a women's prison. And yesterday, in the wake of a story about another transgender prisoner, convicted stalker Tiffany Scott, requesting a move to a women-only facility, ministers announced a pause on the movement of trans inmates with a history of sexual violence against women. This evening, the Justice Secretary, Keith Brown, spoke to Scotland Tonight. Mr Brown, on Wednesday, in the midst of this whole Isla Bryson furore, you said you trusted the Scottish Prison Service to make the right decision. The next day, the First Minister confirmed a risk reassessment was underway, but told MSPs that Bryson would not serve a sentence in a women's prison. Now we hear there's to be a pause in the movement of trans inmates with a history of violence against women. The Scottish Government's all over the place in this, isn't it?
Not at all. I think what we do have is a system which has been very successful in providing a safe environment for not just trans women, but prisoners across the board over many years and dealing with these kind of cases. But we did see public concerns being raised in relation to that case and another case over the last few days. So what we've done in addition to that is to make specific recommendations, specific measures, which will mean that transgender women will not move into the male estate in the circumstances we've described, i.e. when they have had a conviction for sexual offences against women. And that will be true of somebody coming into the prison estate for the first time or somebody moving from the male estate into the female estate. So this is additional reassurance, and there's nothing to say, of course, that these would not have been the outcomes of the processes that the SPS, the Scottish Prison Service themselves would have come to. But it does provide that additional reassurance, given the fact that we know this is an emotive subject on which there is substantial concern.
If you have faith in the prison service, and you said in Parliament that you did, to act correctly, why did the First Minister get involved in the Parliament? Why have you changed things and ordered a review?
Well, it's also the case that we are continually asked a number of questions about individual cases, which is very difficult to comment on. So I think making explicit the circumstances whereby, as I've said in the 2 categories, those people will not transfer to the female estate, I think adds to public reassurance and tries to address the concerns which you've seen raised. I think that's the responsible thing for the government to do. And of course, the UK government has done something very similar in the course of the last week as well. But
don't you have faith that the Scottish Prison Service would have come to that conclusion themselves anyway without your intervention?
Well, we always get continual, as we saw last week, questions about individual cases as soon as they arise, and it's difficult to give specific answers to specific cases. So I think making clear what the general proposition will be is that people will not move from the male estate into the female estate if they have a history of sexual violence against women. I think that was
why did that require your intervention if you were fairly confident the Scottish Prison Service would make that assessment anyway?
I've just made clear, I think it's to provide additional confidence to the public, given, of course, that we're not able to comment very often on individual cases. It was to provide that additional reassurance.
So what trans campaigners are saying is that you've bowed to public pressure, and that would suggest you have.
Well, I've just said that what we've done is try to address the public concerns. It's a very emotive issue. There is genuine public concern about it. But just to be clear, what we are not saying is that trans women present an inherent risk to people in the prison estate. What we're saying is predatory men can present that risk. This is not about all trans people. This is about those that might present a risk. And that is why the Scottish Prison Service does not look to see whether somebody has a GRC to determine whether they go into the female estate. They do a risk assessment of the whole circumstances, and that's the right way to go about things.
But, well, let's bring it down to its basics then. As far as you're concerned, is a trans woman a woman?
Yes.
So if that's the case, how can you send a woman to a men's prison?
Well, we have done that as they do in England and Wales and elsewhere over many years, but that's only done after a proper safety assessment, which involves medical professionals, sometimes psychiatric professionals, and a multi-party assessment of the safety implications of doing that. That's the right and responsible way to do it, and it's been very successful
Okay,
so far.
so does that mean that a trans woman is only a woman who doesn't commit violent crime?
Somebody that designates himself as a trans woman, we treat on face value as a trans person, a trans woman. That's a position that we and most of society, I think, accept. But what we do not do is accept that just that is sufficient to allow somebody to put into an environment where there are vulnerable women. So we do all the other checks which I've mentioned to make sure the safety of prisoners, prison staff and the individual prisoner is looked after. That seems to me to be the responsible way to go about things.
Okay, so as you say, the prison service doesn't require a gender recognition certificate, but there is a wider backdrop to all of this. So would a man with a history of violence, for example, be allowed to apply for a gender recognition certificate?
Well, anybody could apply for one. Whether they get one is a different proposition. And you will know that in the recently passed legislation, which does not impact this process, but in that legislation, there was an amendment from Gillian Martin, an SNP MSP, which said that the police should be able to intervene in that circumstance to issue a prevention order to stop somebody gaining a GRC if the police had such concerns. So that is possible to do at this stage to prevent that from happening if the police have sufficient concerns.
So even if somebody identifies as a woman and wants to become a woman and get a GRC, if they have a violent background, they wouldn't be allowed to, or potentially wouldn't be allowed to?
Well, the legislation that was passed, it does not impact upon the current practices of the prison service, and it's not relevant to the discussion we were having earlier on. But in that circumstance, the new legislation, had it not been struck down by the UK government, despite all the parties and a nearly two-thirds majority in the Scottish Parliament voting for it, that process, as agreed, would allow the police to say, no, we don't think this person is appropriate to get a GRC for these reasons, and to issue a prevention order along those lines.
The Scottish Government are saying that the temporary pause you've announced today should be made permanent. How likely is that?
Well, we have two reviews going on, one of which will report by the end of the week to myself and to the Chief Executive of the Scottish Prison Service. But there is a wider review that's going on just now, which is looking at all these issues, which is also consulted with women's prisoners on the way to take this forward. And we await the outcome of that review. But you've seen the statements that have been made. It gives, as the First Minister said today, a pretty strong indication of the direction of travel. But we await those reviews, let them do their work, and we'll take matters from there. And of course, when the review comes back, the wider review, it can be debated in Parliament by the committee, the Criminal Justice Committee, and everybody can have their say at that time. As
Justice Secretary, have you learned anything over the last week?
Well, I've certainly learned more about the concern because of the cases that have been raised, and I know, of course, that we need to meet that concern, which is why we've taken this further action. But I think that's been very important. We have built on a safe process to provide further public reassurance, and I think that's the right thing to have done.
Justice Secretary, thanks for joining us in Scotland tonight.
Thank you.